first speaker, no disrespect to Kat, but our first external speaker for the afternoon is Jeff Howry. Jeff is a research fellow at the Harvard Semitic Museum right down the road here in Cambridge, Mass, if I'm not mistaken. And when I read his title abstract, or I even read the title of his presentation, I was personally very fascinated because I live in an area where there are a lot of old stone walls going through my property. So I'm really intrigued to find out the work that's been done in this regard, especially in relation to LIDAR, to working with LIDAR. Jeff, are we hearing you? Are you hearing us loud and clear? Making sure we're unmuting you. Are you there, Jeff?
Can you hear me?
Perfect, loud and clear. Yeah, let me give you the screen here, and we'll take it from there. And clicking the right buttons.
Yep.
Excellent.
So.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for agreeing to join us today, and thank you for presenting on this topic, which is very close to the hearts of us here in New England.
Well, I could easily devote an hour to it, but I thought that folks would be interested in seeing work on both sides of the continents. So we're going to be talking about historic landscapes. And as David mentioned, we're all here, or he and I are both in New England. And I want to just point out, David, that you down east in Maine just had your 200th statehood anniversary.
Unmuted.
Because you used to be part of Massachusetts.
Yeah, well, we don't like to remember that. That we'll just forget about that part of our history.
Anyhow, I wanted to take a minute and start by talking not about either parts of the world, my discussion, but about the importance of LIDAR for archaeology and how it has absolutely changed a great deal of the study of ancient civilizations all over the world. It has given insight into the historic landscapes that was never before available. And I have two quick examples here. One is from Angkor Wat in Cambodia, a memorial tomb site that was assumed to be relatively modest, 9 kilometers in area, square kilometers. And LIDAR flown in the past decade has expanded that area to 35 kilometers. And what was thought to be a ceremonial center was in fact a city of 600,000 people. You'll notice the fellow here on the bottom, he's an archaeologist, and he's using the blue marble LIDAR module, which I'm used throughout this work. One other point is the Maya. The people have been researching the Maya lowlands for 150 years, and people have been looking at particular complexes around centers. And in a recent survey of that area with LIDAR, they disclosed 60,000 houses, palaces, and elevated highways with only a half-hour of flight time of LIDAR. So it gives you a sense of the revolution. Here, one of the sites, Caracol, was a ceremonial center. You can see the imagery here on the right. In a few weeks of LIDAR work on 80 square miles, they increased by 8 times the area that they had mapped before. So let's get a little more down to earth here, back to New England. And I realize that there are many people who've never had the pleasure of walking in our woods. And so I'd like to begin by giving a little background history here. We live in a part of the world that was covered by glaciers until about 11,700. On the right-hand side of the screen here, you can see actually where Blue Marble is located. Had they been sitting in their offices 20,000 years ago, they'd be under a mile of ice. It's a little bit better that there today, right, David? So anyhow, this is Massachusetts and New England in large. And what, as outlined here, is the boundary of the maximum glaciation. And the area that was covered by the glacier as it moved and expanded across this landscape ground up a lot of the bedrock and left us with a great deal of stone when it receded. And so, starting back about 400 years ago, in the 1630s, a great number of people, specifically from Eastern England, an area we would call Anglia, or East Anglia, they emigrated to New England, and many of these settlers were tenant farmers, and they were looking for land as the enclosure acts forced them off their land, as the landowners wanted greater quantities of land for more efficient agriculture. So the upper right diorama here sort of shows you what a starting of a field after it had been cleared would look like with the stone walls abounded. We'll get to why the walls were built in just a moment, but it's important to appreciate that with the forest succession after the glaciation, eventually it became a hardwood forest, and a great deal of effort was made to clear the land to get that down to the soil. And if you were to have just removed the trees and burned them, you would have found a soil surface somewhat like this, though maybe a tad bit exaggerated, but a great deal of stone. This is the leftover of the glacier, and it exposed a lot of stone that had to be removed. This generally is a chronology. In the early 1630s and 40s, the major migration began through the occupation of coastal towns, then to interior lands, and finally with the coming of the Industrial Revolution, which also began here in New England, farms became abandoned. The coming of the railroad, which had been preceded by the Erie Canal, dramatically shifted the source of food products and grain from New England to the Midwest, where it could be grown in much larger quantity, and changed the whole market dynamic. Let me go and look at some walls here with you. There are different types of walls. On your left, a common field wall that might have been removed or created as they needed to plow, and we'll get into that in just a moment. Rocks made have lined a cart road, an entrance to a homestead. In some cases, they formed retaining walls or walls along streets. Or here in the lower right, you see a modern, an example here of a wall beautifully preserved that's probably been there for 150 or 200 years. And there were other uses for the stone. Sometimes they built animal pounds. Animals got loose and they needed to be quarantined, and they were put in the town pound, and they had to be retrieved with a fine. Or they built stone foundations for their barns. So there are different types of land that they had to deal with. There was pasture and tillage land and mowing land. Most of these had to be cleared. And the reason they had to be cleared had to do with their plow technology. And in this case, the plow, which was called a moldboard plow, was wooden. And I've given some examples of that. And you can see the plow in the simplest form down here. And so hitting a stone of any size could damage your plow. Even some of the plows had iron tips would damage them. And so this is the way in which much of New England was plowed until the advent of tractors in the 1870s and maybe into the 1890s. But to To remove that stone, you needed, in addition to your oxen, you needed a stone boat. And this was the toughest labor, typically done by men and done in the winter months when there was nothing much more to do. February was the time to get the rocks out of your field, and the normal freezing and thawing of rocks pushed the rocks to the surface, and you got out your stone boat and oxen and got your field cleared and ready for plowing. And this is probably an exceptional example of what walls looked like, but they had to contend with controlling many different types of livestock, not just their cows, but their sheep and hog. And I just want to step back to give context for this, because the whole need for walls was partially driven by the technology of plowing, but also the fact that when the immigrants arrived, they were used to an open field system, particularly for grazing. And this was very incompatible with the land uses of the Native Americans. And some of the earliest legislation involved the land use and creating boundaries. And so the wall was the measure of the bound in many cases. And a special person was appointed in each town called a fence viewer. And these were generally referred to as fences. And these were the people who enforced the boundaries. Let me move on here. They had one other type of stone boundary, and that was piles of stones. And I'm going to give you just a quick example of this, because these are also a stone feature that can sometimes be found on the LIDAR. And I found this great document here of a case where the two men from Lexington, where I live, and the neighboring town of Waltham walked the boundaries of the town in 1747, and many of them were marked by these piles of rocks and stone walls, and it's noted in their document. But let's look at LIDAR a little more closely for New England and the farms. This is a bare ground LIDAR image of a open farmed landscape, more in central Massachusetts. It of course picks up the roads, but what really jumps out here are the boundary walls. And so for those studying the historic landscape of New England, this is absolutely invaluable. But what I wanted to show you, since you're all familiar with LIDAR, was an interesting special case which I got involved in researching near to me in Waltham. An area that was part of a conservation land called the Beaverbrook North and North Waltham area. And this is an aerial view on the right of all the hardwood forest that now occupies this. And this is a large hill with a water tower on the top. And this is what you would normally see. And on the left here is a leaf off condition, which begins to give you a flavor of what might be there. But it's really the LIDAR on the right that begins to show you some of the features that are underneath this forest, which is probably represents 100 to 150 years of regrowth. But you can see here on this elevation LIDAR the stone walls that exist, as well as some of the roads. But what particularly interested me was the areas that today are in wetlands. And in this case, the town had such an interest in stone walls that they actually commissioned a surveyor through contract to map stone walls in the area. And this was one of them. It's called Mackerel Hill because nearby was a large stream and open area that in colonial times was an area where the mackerel migrated upstream. And it was a great collection point. And so both the Native Americans and later the colonists collected the mackerel and dried them on the hillside, and hence its name. But when I looked at the LIDAR, I saw something that the surveyors did not pick up. And that's what I've got in yellow here, and these walls in a low, wet area. And you dive in and you see walls. And I've highlighted, these just jump out at you in the LIDAR. But when you're actually standing there in the season, the vegetated season, you can't see these at all. And what I have on the right is the survey, what the surveyors saw in the walls when they did this in May and June. And this is the area of the wetlands that drew my attention. And it's very clear that the LIDAR makes so much more evident. And just another couple of shots here of the zoomed in area. And there's just an incredible complex of walls. And I'm sorry, I'm going backwards. If you go out there today, you actually will see some of these walls. But if you were to go out there in May or June, you wouldn't see them at all. I thought this was a dramatic example to compare what someone who did by survey did, regular land survey, and what you can see. You go there in the leaf off and no vegetation condition, and know a little bit about reading the landscape. One other quick example about an agricultural landscape. The Bowman family came to Lexington in the very early 1700s. The house here existed until 1905, and they bought hundreds of acres of land. And due to an impending construction of a medical facility, I was driven to go out and try to look at some of the historic landscape of the Bowman family. And using LIDAR, I was able to identify the walls that defined the farm of the Bowman's family that lived there for over 250 years, and finding some of the features with LIDAR of their stone walls and stone boundary system. So for us in New England, this is an incredible tool. But let me jump to the other side of the pond here, and let me show you another area of work that I did this past summer in northern Israel. It's called Megiddo because here is a tell. It is a hilltop that was occupied going back 5,000–6,000 years. This is a primary form of occupation in much of the Near East is the hilltop. And in this case, the tell stood at an interesting point. It was a point between the coast and the inlands, and this is on what's called the Jezreel Valley. If you focus for a minute up here in the left-hand corner, the Mediterranean is on your left, and Haifa and Tel Aviv are up here in the corner here. There's a mountain range, and on the east side of the mountain range is the Jezreel Valley. And Tel Megiddo stood near many of the trade routes that connected the coast to the Silk Road that extended as far east as Mesopotamia. This is just an example of the kind of LIDAR tiles that I had to work with and some of the locations, but the map really shows this relationship, and we'll go back this, but the places to remember are Legio, Lejeune, and Abu Shusha. Legio had its place in history as the camp of the 6th Roman Legion, and it was in the 1st century of the current era that Rome felt it was necessary to protect the trade routes between the Mediterranean and inland areas, and they sent the 6th Legion That's 5,000 Legionnaires to a camp to protect those routes. And what drew me here was not only was I part of a staff doing the excavation of Legio, but also the surrounding areas. And I'll talk about those in the subsequent slides. The areas of particular interest are Al-Lajun, which in Arabic means the Legion. And the villages that grew up to support the Legion were an important component of the landscape. Maximinopolis became a city in the Byzantine era after the Legion left in around 315. And there's also a Roman fort that we're going to look at. This is an aerial from the Royal Air Force in 1945. You can see a lot of the area has been is under intensive agriculture and cleared. And we're going to look at this area, which seems to show nothing. But before I get there, I want to point out that this road here, Route 66 in Israel, was part of the ancient road system that extended from the coast. And the Legio camp nearby was the desired area for the settlement next to Tel Megiddo, in part due to the water sources that were there. And there was a major stream that existed here. In the local parlance, it's called a nahal, a stream. But let me jump into some interesting places in the area. If you were to be heading east from the coast with your donkeys and carrying what you were planning to sell, you would have a place to stay in what would be the equivalent of a roadside motel. Obviously, they didn't have such conveniences as you would get in a motel, but they had places for people to stay, and they called khans or caravan sites. And I'm giving you simply the aerial photos to show you how masked they are by vegetation. This is what it looks like today. You're standing ground level, it's just completely overgrown. You'd have no idea what you were standing next to. However, if you look at the LIDAR of the area, it really jumps out. And this network of khans existed all across the Silk Road, all the way to Mesopotamia and Persia. And this is a picture of what it would look like inside with all the different merchants getting their donkeys into protected areas and spending the night or day. But it's dramatic how this particular structure just jumps out. Nearby, to protect that route, was a Roman fort. And you can see images here blow up from 45 and also what it looks like in vegetated state as it exists today. Some historic photos of someone back in 1901 who made a map of the area. And this is a kind of a bare ground LIDAR. As previous presenters have mentioned, there are different ways to process the LIDAR. This is one way to do it, giving you a general sense of what's there. This is what it looks like ground level, incredibly overgrown. In fact, there was even a forest. This is planted, a pine forest, probably about 40 or 50 years old. And if you walk along the surface, you can see a few features, but not much. Interestingly, you can see the site of the Roman fort through the trees today. But if you look at the LIDAR, you see a wholly different picture. You can see all the structures of the platform terraced areas that were the basis for the camp. And in my survey work, I identified some of those features by having the LIDAR in hand and looking at the different places, and that's what this notation represents as the surveyed features, clearly giving me an incredible tool. I'm going to rush a little bit since I know I have only a few more minutes, but I wanted to give another few examples here. As I mentioned, when the Legionnaires arrived 5,000 strong, they needed to build their camp. They needed not only people to construct it for them, but they needed a constant supply of food. So it was like they had needed a market. And when I was looking in the surrounding area by just ordinary aerial photography, I found this particular area, which is known as the Western Al-Legion, or the Legion Village, and I was struck by the what appeared to be terraces on the village. However, when I processed the LIDAR, it really jumped out. And what you see here on the mound are in fact the walls that define the different residential compounds. And this I've been able to confirm through an historic map that was developed about 1945. But also was evident is the walls that were in the field, and the shadows of those walls really jump out. Interestingly, when you're on the ground, you can't see that very clearly. And it was only in the light of the early morning that I began to see a pattern. And in fact, what those shadows show is the shattered walls whose essentially footprint remains in the soil. And I've highlighted them here with red lines. But clearly, for example, on the hillside, you can see nothing, but the LIDAR showed the pattern. And here, the walls begin to show themselves when you're on the ground and knowing what you're looking for. This is the type of, in the left-hand corner here, this is the type of equipment that would have been used to prepare that field in the last 20 or 30 years. It's also possible with LIDAR to see some of the drainage. This LIDAR image on the right shows the pattern of the drainage that now is no longer visible. And near trying to wrap this up here, I see, wanted to show you what an archaeological excavation looks like. And you're looking across the fields on modern day hay field at an excavation that has two central locations, one on the left called Area B, and this is Area D. And the canopies protect the people while they're excavating. Just so you know, if you do it, it's a great experience. Work starts at 5 a.m. and ends at 1 p.m. It's an early day. But when you look at this Roman Legion site from the air, you see something very different. And you see the rectangular shape. And because it was on the hillside, you see the stepped nature on which the streets and buildings were constructed. On this sloping hillside, somewhat exaggerated, you can begin to see the outlines of this camp that existed for 200 years. I highlighted some of those features, and this was the basis for selecting some of the excavation sites. It's still unknown where these walls meet, but another season may show what actually happened. These dark spots are actually tombs that were probably constructed in the past 700 or 800 years to sacred people or sacred prophets during the Byzantine era. You can see the moats and the drainage areas of the Legio camp as well. And their drainage area jumps out in the LIDAR, which standing on the ground, all you can see is a footpath. And this, in the distance here, Route 65 is in fact what was the old trading route for several millennia. And finally, I wanted to dive into a bit of historic archaeology. About 3-4 kilometers north of Tel Megiddo is Tel Abu Shusha, a tell that may have been occupied as recently as 2,000 years ago. And what happened there isn't known. It's one of the few unexcavated tells in Israel and Palestine. And I was drawn to it because there was a village there that has also not been excavated. And I created this overlay. This is where the tell is located, and the village, the Palestinian village, are on these highlighted areas. I was interested particularly in this because I had aerial imagery from 1945, and I thought that this would be a great test of the LIDAR, since I could see what existed 80 years ago and compare that with my LIDAR imagery. And this is an example of the overlay of the imagery on the actual tell and village. And this is what the LIDAR looks like, the bare ground LIDAR. And you can see a lot of structural features here, as well as the roadways that existed. And upon getting to that site and walking it, I was able to discern features that had not been discovered before. 2 years earlier, an intensive terrestrial survey had been conducted, and they had not found, they had found materials, but they hadn't found, for example, this large platform site up here and the terraced hillside that existed with definitive features, in some cases, walls. And so this has provided a very useful tool for discerning and creating a baseline for interpreting the LIDAR for this area and for archaeological sites. And I have just a few slides here. One of the things that British and colonial folks introduced was yucca cactus, and they became boundary systems, boundaries, and you can see features on the LIDAR that are in fact house sites. Here, standing on top, you can see what was the terrace of probably a high house, and down here you can see all the terracing of the other residences, even seeing cisterns. And so we're beginning to see more of what the village is composed of, and clearly there are things that are not observable by terrestrial survey that the LIDAR provides us, structures and walls and hedges, and the near surface features of the walls as well. So as a coincidence, I was speaking recently and made a presentation on walls, and a fellow archaeologist said, oh yes, we do survey in northern New England completely covered with forest, and LIDAR is invaluable for finding what was there. So I think this sort of wraps up some of my research that I've done in 2 different parts of the world. And it's been in the help that I've gotten from Blue Marble has been fantastic. And I wanted to mention particularly Mackenzie. Mackenzie Kiley was really helpful on their support staff. And the work that I did was supported by the Jezreel Valley Regional Project, which has been ongoing for a decade. If any of you have more questions or like to know more about it, you can certainly email me. And here's my contact information. This will be on the published slides that will be coming out. So I think at that point, I will end that. If there are any questions,
Yeah,
glad to hear them.
So much, very, very interesting. I'm not going to be able to walk through my property the same way again. Encountering my stone walls, I'll be out grabbing some LIDAR. Just we are obviously a little tight on time here, and just to let you know, we're going to change our schedule slightly going forward. Our next presenter is going to be Walter Payne. So we're going to, if you're looking at the schedule in the PDF, we're going to change it slightly for the rest of the afternoon. A quick question, Jeff, before we let you go, and that's in regard to maybe they say the accuracy, but perhaps the resolution of the LIDAR. How much, what type of LIDAR do you need to be able to detect a stone wall? Let's say, for instance, here in New England, we've got all that foliage. How are we able to detect that LIDAR, those stone walls with the, was it, I assume it was airborne LIDAR, I assume it was just publicly available LIDAR files?
Yes. Yes, fortunately here in Massachusetts, as I believe is true in many other states, um, the LIDAR is available free. Massachusetts has its own division called MassGIS. You can go to that site, and they have made multiple LIDAR sets available for free. It's actually hosted by NOAA. They have a pretty good website that lets you select an area and give you the LIDAR in minutes. It's the LIDAR resolution that I used here in New England is less than a meter. It's okay. There are parts of Massachusetts where we've got maybe 30, 40 centimeter resolution, which is absolutely great. It's a little bit more than I think you can get with commercial grade satellite data, but do look around. Every state has it. New Hampshire has great LIDAR and a great site for that too.
Yeah, as we do up here in Maine as well, we've got a lot of publicly available data. Jeff, thank you so much. That was very, very interesting, and again, a very personal level, something that near and dear to my heart because of where I live. There are some more questions. We will make sure that you connect with Jeff. We will direct any other questions to Jeff directly. You've also got his contact information here right on the slide as well. If you've been able to jot that down, I'm sure you'll be most interested in answering additional questions. So thank you so much, Jeff. I really, really appreciate that.